Please give a warm post-snack welcome to Chip Conley.
I like that Paige and I share joy in the name of our company, Joie de Vivre and Client Joy. So hi, everybody. How are you? This is gonna be a bit of a personal story. I've never given this talk before, so bear with me. It's gonna be a little bit about the story of how millennials and boomers can learn from each other, and what I learned in my experience of being both a mentor and an intern at Airbnb. So let me give you a little bit of my background, and then I'll be doing this for about 15 minutes, and then Paige will come back up. We'll do some Q&A, and I guess you'll have some chance to ask some questions too. So my story is, you're all familiar with the Jupiter Hotel here in Portland, right? So I started 30 years ago, Joie de Vivre, creating a place called the Phoenix Hotel. It's sort of like the Jupiter Hotel of San Francisco, but started way before the Jupiter. It was a rock and roll hotel. And then I grew the company to 52 hotels over my 24 years of being the founder and CEO of that company. So I decided to sell my company about 5 years ago. Now, Robert De Niro, in the Intern, anybody see the Intern before? So Robert De Niro in the Intern says at one point, musicians don't retire, they stop when there's no music left inside of them. So I could have retired, but I was sort of in a place where I had music inside of me. I was on the board of Burning Man, and have been for about 5 years now. And so I decided to create a website called Fest 300, which is the world's best website for finding festivals. And we feature the top 300 in the world. So that's what I was going to do. I was going to live a life just going around the world to festivals and enjoy myself. And then one day I got a call from a guy named Brian Chesky. So Brian is the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb. He called me and said, I want to actually have you be my mentor because you have a long history in hospitality. We would like this company, this little millennial tech company, to become an actual big-time hospitality company someday. We'd like to have you help us. We want you to come and give a talk on hospitality innovation in our offices. And I went over there. I really didn't know much about Airbnb. I thought it was sort of like couch surfing. I thought they were the same company, to be honest with you. I didn't even know that. So I was clearly an over-the-hill hotelier. But when I went to the offices, I saw a lot of curious people, and people were really intrigued. So Brian said to me, and his two co-founders said, we want you to come here. We want you to actually help us. Are you willing to do that? Well, I had to tell them, I've never used Airbnb. This is 3 years ago. I don't even have an Uber or a Lyft app on my phone. I haven't even gotten to that place. And so they said, okay, let's just, we'll try this out. And we agreed on 15 hours a week that I would help them take their company and turn it into a hospitality company. Within about 3 weeks, I realized that Brian misheard me. He didn't hear 15 hours a week. He heard 15 hours a day, yes. The immersive nature of being in a tech company. So I dove in. Now, I will say I was a little intimidated because, to be honest with you, I was twice the age of the average employee in this company. Now, having my Fest 300 team, which is a bunch of youngsters in this company that I started, and being on the board of Burning Man meant that I didn't have a problem being around young people. But I had never been in a tech company. I didn't really understand tech. In fact, the whole ethos of Airbnb was sort of like, I code, therefore I am. And I don't code. So did I exist? In fact, the first day I was at Airbnb, this engineer came up to me, and I think this was like a test. He said, if you ship a feature and nobody uses it, did it really ship? I didn't even know what shipping meant, shipping product. Like, I was in deep ship. I mean, I was in a lot of trouble because I really didn't understand the language. I also was now reporting to a guy 21 years younger than me. And I didn't have to. I was retired. But I was fascinated. I was really curious. And over these last 3 years, my 3-year anniversary was last Friday, I've learned a lot. And I think the team at Airbnb has learned a lot from me. So let me tell you about some of my key lessons. And if there's a real lesson here overall, there is intergenerational transfer of wisdom that's available in the modern era. In the past, we sort of thought of elders as the ones with all the answers. and you sat at their feet and you asked them questions. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the digital era. So my first lesson, I'm going to give you 3 lessons. My first lesson is be curious. Be very, very curious. So the great news about being an old guy in a young company and being in a tech company and not having any tech background is it was pretty obvious I was naive and I didn't know a lot about the language. But that meant that I had a beginner's mind. And when you have a beginner's mind, you can ask naive questions that nobody else has been asking. And you can actually prove yourself and maybe the company that no one is a know-it-all. We're all still learning. So in the early days of my time at Airbnb, I was like, well, God, this is a lot of work to actually book an Airbnb home. Like, it's so much easier with a hotel. And so there were some things we started to look at about how to create Instant Book, how to actually make the process simpler, how to actually reduce the number of steps. But also then there was the question of, like, which is the place I'm going to stay in? And for 3 years now, I've been sounding the drum of matchmaking. Airbnb needs to be a matchmaker. If there are 70,000 homes in Paris on Airbnb, that is a true fact. 70,000 homes on Airbnb in Paris. How do I get the 12 homes that are best suited for me up for me so I don't have the paradox of choice of trying to choose between 70,000? So these are the kinds of questions I asked 3 years ago, and really good news is that over the last 3 years, we've gotten better at matchmaking and Instant Book and a variety of other things that the company might have done anyways, but sometimes it was just that naive question from the beginner's mind that opened people up. I also learned pretty quickly that if you're going to be both an intern and a mentor, you intern publicly and you mentor privately. Let me explain what I mean by that. It means, to be honest with you, there were people in those early meetings I was in, I had been a CEO of a company I'd founded, and I'd been doing that for 24 years. I wasn't used to just like keeping my mouth shut. But I realized quickly that the person across the room who's half my age, who just said something really stupid, emotionally stupid, frankly, for some other people in the room, I don't need to point that out in front of everybody else in the room, because it's like his father actually telling him and criticizing him for something he did. So I would actually start mentoring people privately, giving them feedback, but publicly, I was just the naive beginner's mind in the room. It changed some of the way the company started to think about things, because it allowed us to ask questions that people had been too nervous to actually ask. So that's the number one theme is be very curious. Number 2 is, I call this iPhoney versus iHuman. iPhoney, we have an iPhone. I don't have mine on me right now, but if I did, I could look at the face of my phone, and if you were 25 years younger than me and you look at the face of your phone, you know what to do with that thing better than I do. And you know what goes on inside of that phone better than I do. But if I'm looking at you, I bet I know what's going on inside of you, and I bet I actually can read your face better than the person next to me who's 25 years younger than me. So there are a lot of digitally savvy people at Airbnb. Frankly, some of the best in the world. We're hiring people from the best companies in the world. And they're really smart at digital. They're not necessarily emo-savvy, emotionally savvy. And the thing we've seen at Airbnb is those who actually succeed in leadership at the Airbnb over time are generally people who are really good at emotional intelligence. But how do you teach it? So Brian asked me, about 3 weeks into me being 15 hours a week, right? He said, I want you to set up learning and development. I want you to teach 28-year-olds how to manage 24-year-olds. And I want you to actually teach them things like how to design an alliance with somebody across the table from them who actually wants to see them lose. Or actually, how do you walk into a room and read the energy of a room and evolve the communication that you're going to do based upon that. So that's what I started to do. And that's been really thrilling. It's been really interesting to just see what does it mean to be observant. In that same The Intern, Anne Hathaway is the CEO of the company. Robert De Niro is the intern. She didn't want Robert De Niro to be her personal intern in the first part of the movie. Why? She said he was too observant. Too observant. Well, honestly, great leaders are really observant, especially around emotions, because emotions are contagious. So second point is understand emotions. A millennial can learn a lot from a boomer, based upon emotional intelligence that can be taught. Lastly, the third thing I've learned in my 3 years at Airbnb is what I would say, it's not just know how, it's know who. Now, Google is the best in the world at search. And the truth is, we are all moderately addicted to search engines like Google. But not always does Google have the nuance. They don't necessarily exactly understand what it is you're looking for. But if I sit down with someone and give and sort of deposit into the emotional bank account, which is an old-time phrase from Stephen Covey, meaning I'm going to actually do something for you because sometime in the future you may do something back for me. But it's a very relevant piece of advice for anybody in an organization. By sitting down with people and hearing what they're working on and realizing that because I've lived a lot longer, I'm pretty well read and well connected. I like reading a lot of books, I like reading academic studies, and I have a lot of friends in my network. So by sitting down with someone, I'm able to sort of say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? The kinds of things that Google could never get for them. That nuance. And what has been really fascinating, I remember Brian, about 6 months into me being at the company, he said to me, you're talking to all these people outside of your department, outside of your team. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? And I said, well, they ask me. They come to me and they want some advice. They want mentorship, or they want to just ask like, who would I know, or what would I recommend for them for something that they're actually looking for? What Brian now says 3 years later is, Chip, you became like the sort of nerve center, the web for the company. You understood what was happening in the whole company. So I could sit down with the 3 founders and have a really deep conversation about just about any different department in the company, which gave me a lot of value to those founders. But I'm going to wrap up and just say, this has been a real journey. I mean, for 3 years, I've been a guy in my mid-50s working for someone who's three touchdowns younger than me. And in the process, being both a learner and a teacher, I've seen a symbiotic relationship created. Yes, 3 years later, Airbnb is now the most valuable hospitality company in the world. When I got there 3 years ago, we didn't even consider ourselves a hospitality company. During the Q&A, Paige will ask me some questions around hospitality, but it's been really fascinating to say, how do you take a company that's a tech company and turn it into a hospitality company, and what are the elements that we needed to do to make that work, such that we have the highest scores today in the hospitality industry in terms of guest satisfaction, about 5 to 7 points above what's the average for the global hotel companies. So it's been quite a lesson for me. It's been a lesson also in knowing that we have something to learn from each other, millennials and boomers. There's no doubt about that. So the thing that actually I wanted to wrap up with is saying 2 things. Number one is, I'm probably going to live 10 years longer than my parents. Many of us are going to live 10 years, or maybe for those of you 25 or 28, you might, if the singularity people get it right, you might live forever. But I'm going to live 10 years longer than my parents. And in a digital society, power is moving 10 years younger. Interesting. So I'm going to live 10 years longer, and power is moving 10 years younger, as evidenced by the average age of the CEOs of tech companies today versus 25 years ago. So what does that mean for me as a boomer? It means I have 20 additional years of obsolescence and irrelevancy. Stop, I'm sorry. If we don't, as boomers, get relevant by creating that beginner's mind, being curious, using our emotional savvy to help others, and also being that networked know-how, not just the know-how, but the know-who that can actually help others. There's a great African proverb. Oh, by the way, also, important fact sociopolitically on this, there are 3 times as many people age 70 or older working in the workforce today as compared to 1990, 25 years ago. So this is a very relevant issue in terms of how do we actually create this intergenerational education from boomers to millennials and back. Last thought, there's an African proverb, quite famous, that said, when an elder dies, it's like a library has burned down. Well, today, libraries and elders aren't quite as popular as they used to be, but wisdom never grows old. And wisdom is just about pattern recognition, really being able to see the pattern in things. And truthfully, the older you are, the more patterns you've had a chance to see. And therefore, the more you can potentially offer those people who are younger who haven't seen those patterns yet. Now, it doesn't mean that wisdom doesn't happen at a young age. Some people have the capacity to accelerate that process. I'm just going to wrap up by saying I inflicted a lot of patterns on you today with what I wore. I got this at Burning Man from a guy from Bangladesh. This is African. These are Peruvian. Patterns are where it's at. Being able to understand patterns is what computers do really well. What humans do well is understand emotional patterns. And when you can actually see that, and you can become the expert at that, you'll do something that a computer could never offer, at least in the next 10 or 20 years. So, thank you for letting me be here, and Paige, come on out and help me.
I'm going to set my timer so I don't ask too many questions or talk too much. Okay, so thank you. That was awesome. Thank you very much. I was thinking a lot about your experience as a hotelier. And you've worked in hotels for years now. Why come to Airbnb? I mean, doesn't that seem like your competitor? I mean, why are you doing this?
Yeah, no, I'm still a hotelier. I sold the management company, but I still own 14 hotels with partners. So I'm both an Airbnb, senior executive and a hotelier at the same time, which is a bit of cognitive dissonance. But I actually don't think that hotels and homes are mutually exclusive. We did a study in New York, in Manhattan, with Smith Travel Research, which is the best-known data company for the hotel industry. We gave them all of our data, access to all of our data, to actually see what impact Airbnb was having on hotels in New York, or specifically in Manhattan, which is our biggest city in terms of the annual revenues. And what they found was fascinating. They basically said their language, there was no smoking gun. In essence, what they said is the hotel industry in Manhattan actually has had a rough last 3 or 4 years. It's only because they built too many hotel rooms. So Airbnb is not zero-sum game with hotels. Why? Well, about 35 to 40% of the people who are staying on Airbnb would have either stayed with friends or family for free or would not have made the trip. So in some ways, it's just helping to expand the pie. That's one thing. Secondly, in New York, what they found was that 60% of the people staying with Airbnb in New York, 60% of the room nights, were people staying a week or longer. So a lot of the people who use Airbnb are using it for extended stay, for an extended stay experience. And they want to live like a local in an apartment or a home. And it's a more affordable way to do that. And actually a more comfortable way to do that. Staying in a hotel room in a small box for 2 weeks in a row isn't a whole lot of fun. So I guess for me, more than anything, I was curious. I did not understand what Airbnb and home sharing was 3 years ago. I had never used it. Now it's almost exclusively how I travel. But more than anything, I really was fascinated by the culture of the company. And the fact that these 3 founders didn't have anybody in the company who had a travel or hotel background.
So I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Where are my microphones at?
Hey there. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
What is the greatest mistake you see millennials making professionally?
I think the greatest mistake I see we're based in San Francisco. I lived in the Bay Area since 1978, went to Stanford undergrad, went to Stanford Business School. So in that world, what I see is people, young people, more focused on what's the upside of the business plan than what's in their 20s, than they are focused on what's the upside of the people I'm going to surround myself with and learn from and learn with. And so I think the idea of having real clarity of who am I going to learn from is as important or more important than the title or even the company you're going to work for, because you learn so much during your 20s, and a lot of people don't even know who they're going to report to when they get their job offer. and that's the first thing I would ask, is who am I going to work directly with, and how am I going to learn from them?
There's a lot of things that go into what you guys are doing, and this is the most incredible time to be alive because it's inspirational and aspirational communities. Once people understand consumer empowerment and radical transparency of data and privacy and security of information, everything changes. Because right now we have a bunch of advertising agencies, and once the story goes direct in everything, and we're starting to see McDonald's, we're starting to see Starbucks go direct in conversations, Uber, Apple, they make products, you make products. So the hotel industry is now going, oh my God, I have to capture that moment. I have to capture that moment, empower the consumer, and start going up this way. So what you guys have done is really planted the seed for an amazing future in all sorts of industries. As Brian Solis says, every industry is going to be transformed by simply consumer empowerment, radical transparency data. So you're fabulous.
Well, thanks. The thing that I say to the hotel industry is that there's something called revenue management. Revenue management are the people at hotels that try to define how you're going to price your hotel and how you're going to distribute your product out there. 25 years ago, the hotel industry didn't have revenue management. We learned it sort of from the airline industry in terms of pricing. Well, today, the number one thing that hotel companies really need is data scientists, and they don't have them. And they don't have tech infrastructure that's set up to do what you've just described. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure they're going to get there because the hotel industry is generally a franchising industry. So these companies like Marriott or Hilton have to decide, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on this when in fact they're just charging franchise fees to an owner. So long story short is it means that there's it's much slower innovation. I've disrupted the hotel industry twice now. First as like one of the first boutique hoteliers, and now at Airbnb. And I can just say that the industry moves very slowly. And I think that's to our credit. But the good news for the hotel industry is that there are reasons why you stay in a hotel that Airbnb won't be able to replicate. I mean, just for ease of check-in and check-out, for conferences and meetings, for being downtown for a business trip and wanting a lot of services, that's not going away.
I got a question up here.
I am also a baby boomer, and I thank you for giving me 3 more tools to help fight what I would call imposter syndrome. There's an imposter syndrome out there for people like ourselves in this tech world who look around and wonder if we belong, if we can think in these terms. Do you still feel imposter syndrome, and what else do you do if and when you feel it?
So that's a great question. I have never felt imposter syndrome in this respect. I felt it in many other respects. I've never felt it because I literally said, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about in my first day. So I wasn't an imposter because an imposter is trying to fake your way through it. I was like, I don't get it. But what I could bring to the table, and that was helpful. And I still am that way. I mean, there's so many times I really look to my technical leadership team to help me with that. But there's so many other areas where I have something to offer. And that's really it. If you can get to this place where you realize it is a symbiotic relationship, in the past it was like the elders knew it all. And today it's like the best elders are not full of answers, they're full of catalytic questions. And they create catalytic curiosity. And if you create catalytic curiosity in an organization, you create a smarter, more inquiring organization that probably is going to be willing to disrupt itself. Because at the end of the day, Airbnb, as big as we've gotten now, we need to constantly look at how we're disrupting ourselves.
Do we have time for one more?
So I'm an admittedly less techie millennial, and I have found that it's really difficult to talk to employers about. I think that I have high emotional intelligence, and a lot of that has to do with traveling and just spending time with people. What's your advice to me in terms of like selling that to a potential employer? And maybe the flip side of that question is, what's your advice to employers who don't seem to get that that is something that's really important to have in their organization?
And when you say that, meaning emotional intelligence?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, liberal arts major here. I don't have a, thank you, history, yeah,
That's
it's
great.
important.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the best way for me to answer that, it's a hard question to answer sort of generally. So I would just say the best thing to look at as you're looking at employment is what's the culture of the organization. And if you were to come up with, when I was a boutique hotelier, the way we created boutique hotels is we came up with a magazine and 5 adjectives that defined each hotel. And that became the personality of the hotel, and we ultimately found that those are the people who fell in love with the hotel were people who actually saw that the 5 adjectives were sort of their aspirational self, so they got an identity refreshment. That's a longer story. But I think that happens with employees and cultures. Airbnb has a very different culture than Uber. And so the nature of the place is going to tell you whether it resonates with you and who you are. And you need to look for a culture that actually has higher emotional intelligence and maybe a more collaborative atmosphere, et cetera, and I'd say go for that first, as opposed to looking at like which company is on the fastest rocket ship trajectory.
All right, that's all we have time for. A warm round of applause.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you.